Welcome back, everyone. This is Cubstart Web, and this is Lecture 5. Today, we're going to be learning more about APIs, promises, and fetch. Okay, so let's just do some recap. So, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, um, we use APIs to get data from a different program. So let's say in this example, we have the National Weather Service. Let's say they have a database full of weather data, and there are many different weather apps that want to use this data. Well, the API acts as the bridge between the actual database and their web apps. So as we talked about, we use HTTP, which is basically a request response model that helps us get the data using the API. So the client, which is usually like the browser, will make a request, and then the server, which stores the API, will provide a response. Okay, so this should all sound familiar. Um, as you should recall, we have a lot of different types of HTTP requests we can make. So the most common one is GET, but we also have delete, post, put, and you can see all of them here used with different endpoints for this hypothetical books API. Okay. Okay, so let's get into the new stuff. How do we integrate APIs into a web application? Okay. So the way we do this is through asynchronous functions. Okay, so basically, to give a little preview, so JavaScript is what we call single-threaded. So this means that it can only execute one line of code at a time. Okay, so it'll run one line of code, and then after that one line is finished running, it'll go to the next and the next. Okay, but when we're fetching data from an API, doing it in that way synchronously will take a very long time. Like, for example, think about Instagram. When you're scrolling through Instagram, you can see many posts at one time. But if it was synchronous, Instagram would have to load one post at a time, and you would have to wait for each post to load before you can see the next. That would be very annoying to deal with, and no web application wants to be formatted like that. Okay, so when we do data retrieval, which is what APIs do, it is asynchronous. Okay, so that means that different tasks that occur in our program can happen concurrently. Okay, so you can see in in this diagram, the synchronous tasks take 45 seconds because each one happens one after the other. But the asynchronous tasks happen in 20 seconds because they all happen concurrently. Okay. So that may seem like all our problems are fixed because it's asynchronous, but it can get a little messed up sometimes if we don't do it correctly. Okay. So let's say we have this function get data. Okay. This get data function fetches a random Pokemon from a hypothetical Pokemon API. Okay. When it fetches that Pokemon, then we console.log it, so we should print it on the console. So what do you expect for it to print? Well, we expect it to print some random Pokemon, right? But instead, it prints undefined. So why does that happen? Okay, so like I said before, data retrieval is asynchronous, which means when we call this function that retrieves data, it retrieves it asynchronously, okay? So what happens is this first line of the code runs, and while the function fetch random Pokemon is retrieving the data, it already goes to the next line, console.log, and tries to print out this Pokemon um, variable, even though we haven't retrieved the data yet. Okay, so it hasn't stored our random Pokemon in our variable before we console.log it. Okay, so that is not ideal, right? So how do we fix it? Okay. Yeah. So what is a Pokemon? So what is Pokemon if it's not yet retrieved the Pokemon data? Okay. So what we call it is a promise. Okay. So what is a promise? There's two definitions. Okay, number one, a promise represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. Another definition is a promise is a proxy for a value not necessarily known when the promise is created. Okay, so you can kind of think of it like this. So it's kind of like a placeholder for what the actual value will be eventually. So when we call fetch random Pokemon, it gives us a promise that it will eventually give us an actual value. Okay. Now, there are a couple states that a promise can be in, okay? First, it could be pending, which is the initial state. So it's neither fulfilled or rejected yet, meaning it's still getting the data. It could be resolved, which means that the operation was completed successfully, or it could be rejected, meaning that the operation failed, okay? So going back to this example, the reason that we got undefined in the console is because the promise was still pending. Okay. So we console.logged when the promise was pending, not resolved or rejected. So we didn't get anything in the console. Okay. Hope that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. It's like I said, this promise is in the pending state. So we got undefined. Okay, so how do we fix this? How do we force JavaScript to follow the asynchronous timeline of data retrieval? And the way we do that is through these keywords called async and await. Okay, so let's modify our example from before so that we actually get a value. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is add this async keyword in front of function. The way that what this does is basically marks this function as an asynchronous function, okay? And then when we fetch our Pokemon data, we put this await keyword right before, which basically says, wait for this function to resolve its promise before it goes to the next line, okay? So because we waited until it either resolved or rejected the promise, we actually got a value in our console this time. Okay, so, oops, sorry. So like I said, it goes to this line, it waits for fetch random Pokemon to resolve its promise, and then it console.logs whatever is in Pokemon. And now you can see our console will say whatever Pokemon we got, which in this case is Squirtle. Okay? So, error handling. Like I said before, a promise isn't always resolved. It can also be rejected. So how do we handle that? Okay? So, like I said before, or like before, we have our async function. But in this case, we're going to um, put a try block around our block of code. Okay, so we put what we had originally in our try. Okay, so basically it's saying we're going to try doing this block of code. And if it works, then it works great. If it doesn't, then we'll enter this catch block, which will run whatever code is in the catch. And so in this case, we're console.logging whatever our error was. Okay. So this is just a way to ensure that your code doesn't or your program doesn't like basically like crap out if we run into an error. Okay, just kind of best practice in coding. Obviously not necessary, but it's a good way to minimize errors in your code. Okay. Okay, another way we can do the whole like async await thing is using then and catch. So we usually use async and await, but sometimes you can see then catch format in like older code. Um, so let's see how we do it. So you can see in this case, there's no async in front of function. It's just going to be the regular format for functions. But now what we're going to do is we're going to call our fetch function first. So we're fetching our data, and then we're going to have a dot then and a dot catch. Okay. The way this works is if the promise is resolved, then it will execute whatever function is in the then method. Okay. If the promise is rejected, it'll handle the error in the other function that is inside of the parentheses of the catch method. Okay? So we can look at an example to get a better gist of how this works. You can see here, let's say we call fetch random Pokemon, we get an actual value and the promise is resolved. Well, then whatever data we get from this fetch function will be stored in this variable poke, and it'll do whatever we want with it inside of the function. So in this case, we're console.logging it. And you can see here, we're using our shorthand function syntax to do this, okay? And then if the fetch function gives us an error and the promise is rejected, then we store the error in this error variable and the console.log that error. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, we'll probably be using async and await most of the time, but this is also helpful to know. Okay, the reason it's helpful to know is because it can do this thing called chaining. Okay, so the way chaining works is, let's say you fetch data and it gives you a promise, okay? But then that promise is used to get you another promise, okay? Well, we can keep going forever doing this chain of promises. So then how do we handle all of them, okay? Well, we can use this promise chaining so that each promise can go to the next then in the chain. Okay, so you can see here, when we fetch data for the first time, it goes into promise one, and then something happens in the function, and we return fetch more data, which gives us a second promise that goes into promise two, and then we do whatever we want with that promise, okay? At the very end, like the previous example, we need a catch. Okay. And this catch catches any errors from any of the promises in our chain of thens. Okay. So this is convenient because then we don't have to put a catch for every single then. We can just have one catch that can catch anything at the bottom of our chain. Okay. So now that we got the basics down, how do we actually fetch data from an API in JavaScript? Okay, so how do we actually apply this knowledge so we can use it in our own web applications? So we use this fetch method, this built-in fetch method that JavaScript gives us, okay? It's basically an easy way to fetch resources asynchronously, and it's really simple for getting something from an API. So the syntax is just fetch, parentheses, and then the URL of the API. And then there's an optional parameter called options, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But to get an example, you can see here, like how we did with the fetch random Pokemon, we're going to do async in front of function, await in front of the fetch function. And you can see here we do fetch and a URL. So you can see this is the API URL, right? Getting that specific Pokemon. And then we have these two lines, okay? So it's a little different from when we had just like an arbitrary fetch random Pokemon, right? What does that actually mean? So this is kind of like what would happen inside that function. So you can see here, we do await fetch and then this URL. So that gets us the that gives us just like the network response itself. Okay, so it's not actually the object yet. Then using that response, we do response.json, and that parses it as a JSON object, the kind that you're used to seeing. Okay, and you can see here we have to do await for both of these function calls. Because they're both data retrieval and we don't want it to move to the next line too early. Okay, so yeah, like I said before, parses the response body as JSON. And you can see in the console now, it prints out this JSON object. Okay, so that makes sense. Now we can also add options as the second parameter. Okay, like I was saying, this is an optional parameter. You don't have to use it, but sometimes an API needs it. So like always check the API documentation to see if this is necessary. But you can see here, we do await fetch. The API URL, and then here we have this like object with different things we can put inside of options, okay? So the default for fetch is always going to be get. But let's say we want to do a post, put, or delete request. Well, then we need to change this method to whatever we want it to be. And also we can add headers and just other options to modify our request. Okay? Okay, nice. So we got through the information. So now let's try doing a demo, okay? You can follow along if you want. If you don't have to, but it's always helpful. So if you want to follow along, open up VS Code or whatever IDE you have and set up just like a normal HTML file, okay? So let's say we want to get some dogs. Okay, so we're going to be using the dog API. You can see here I have the documentation open, right? So we're going to use this dog API to create a website that lets you choose different dogs and then using that option, give us an image of that specific type of dog, okay? So let's set up the body. First of all, we'll just do a little header. Okay, H1. Okay, we're going to say random dog image. Okay, and now we need two more tags. We're going to have a select tag. Okay, and basically this is like a drop down. Okay, so we'll give it an ID. We'll call it breed selector. And this drop down is empty right now, but eventually we'll fill it with different options of breeds that the user can choose from. And now we need an image tag. Okay. So that we can put the image of the dog somewhere, okay? And we're gonna call this dog image. Okay, so obviously when we run this, it's gonna be pretty blank. It's gonna say random dog image, and you can see this is our select tag, which is our drop down. Right now we have nothing in it, but using our API, we'll fill it with information. Okay? So now that you have those three tags, let's work on the JavaScript, okay? So if you haven't already, create a JavaScript file and let's get working. Okay, so we want to first get or create variables that reference our two tags in our HTML. So we want one to reference breed selector and we want one to reference dog image. So we can modify both using JavaScript, okay? So first let's make a const variable. We'll call it select L and we'll document.get element by ID. And the ID was breed selector. Okay, now let's do the same thing for the image. We'll do const image element, and we'll do document dot get element by ID, and this ID was called dog image. Okay, now that we have two variables for our tags, let's set up our website. Okay, so we want to fill the select tag or our drop down with options for breeds. So where do we get those breeds from? Well, that's what the API is for, right? Okay, so like we talked about in the slides, we're going to create an async function. We'll call it setup. And this is where we're going to request data from our API. Okay, so again, like in the slides, we're going to make a response variable. We're going to do await. So it waits for the data retrieval to finish, fetch, and now we need to get our URL. So what is our URL? Well, that's what documentation is for. We're going to look at the API. We want to get a list of all the breeds. Well, you can see here, I'm in documentation, list all breeds. You can see this is the URL we use to get a list of all the breeds. So let's paste that right in. Okay, and now this response variable will be the network response from our API. And now let's convert that to a JSON object. Okay, so we'll do const data equals await response.json. Okay, now data will be our JSON object. Okay, but we also want, okay. pause for a sec. You can see here when we get the list of breeds, it is in this format. Okay. It's in this format of a JSON object with a lot of breeds, and it's inside message, okay? And you see inside message, there's a long list of keys, which are all the breeds. So how do we get those specific keys? Okay, well, first, let's make a list. So we'll do const again breeds, and we want to get the keys. So the way we do that is we do object.keys, and where are we getting the keys from? Well, we're getting the keys from that message object inside of our JSON object. Okay, so we're going to do data, which is the JSON object, dot message. And so this object dot keys will get only the keys from that message, which is a list of breeds. Okay, so perfect. Now we have a list of breeds. And now we want to go through each breed and add it to our select tag. So how do we do that? Well, if we want to traverse through a list, we always use a for loop. So let's use our for loop. We'll do for const breed of breeds. And inside here, we're going to create an option element. Okay, so if you're not familiar with the select element, the way it works is we have the outer select element, and inside are option tags that are basically all the options in our drop-down list. Okay, so we're going to create another variable. We'll call it option element, and we'll create an element. Create element. Okay, and the element type is option. Great. So now we need to fill it with the correct information. First of all, we need to change the text content to breed, which is the current breed we're on. And we also need to change the value because the value is how we is what we access inside the JavaScript. Okay, so do breed to. Great. And now that we have this option element filled with whatever current breed we're on, we want to add it to our select element. So how do we do that? We append it to it. So we do select L dot append child. And what are we appending? We're appending option L. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Let's see if it worked. Okay. We're going to call setup. And then we're going to reload our site and see if our dropdown is filled. Okay, look, didn't have to reload. You can see now it has all of the breeds that the API has. Okay, so great. But you can see no matter what we press, no image is showing up because we haven't gotten there yet. Okay, so now let's do that. So from what you learned before, how do we change something in our website based on an action that the user does? Okay. Well, I hope you have the answer in your head. We use an event listener, right? So we're going to add an event listener to our select element because every time our select element changes, we want to do an action, which is generate an image, right? So we're going to do select L dot add event listener. Okay. And when do we want to run this function? We want to run it when select element changes. So we're going to do change. And then we're going to do a function here. Okay. Usually we do this, right? We do the parentheses, the arrow, and then we create a function, right? But we need to retrieve data from our dog API, right? Because we're going to retrieve the image to generate. So because we're retrieving data, that means we need to make this an async function. Okay. Now this is an async function. First of all, let's get whatever breed that we're getting. So we're going to do const selected breed equals select L dot value. This will get whatever value is currently in our dropdown. Now we're going to fetch data from our API. So how do we get an image of a specific type of dog from this dog API? Once again, we're going to check our documentation. You can see here This is kind of an example. You can see when we do HTTP blah 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 dog.ceo slash API slash breed, the type of breed slash images slash random, that gets us a random image from that is that breed, right? So we want to copy this format, but with whatever breed is currently selected. Okay, so I'm gonna help myself just copy this first part. Okay, let's go back here. We're gonna do the same format we did in setup. We're gonna do const response equals await, once again, fetch. And now what are we fetching? Okay, so I'm first gonna paste this in, okay? And now we want to follow this format you see here. So instead of whatever this breed is, we want to put whatever breed that we stored in our selected breed variable. So we're going to do some string concatenation, okay? We're going to do plus and then selected breed, okay, plus, and then slash images, if I can spell it right, images slash random. Okay. Now, when the string is all smushed together, it should look exactly the same as this format right here, which gets us a random image. Okay. Great. So once again, we need that const variable data to parse it as a JSON. So we'll do await response.json. Okay. Now that we have the JSON object, we need to get specifically the image source from our object. So once again, like our breeds list, it's going to be inside the message key, right? So we're going to do const, we'll call it image source, set that equal to data.message, and that gets us whatever's inside the message. So let me see if there's an example. Um, yeah, you can see here, this is a random image of a dog, and you can see inside the JSON object, there's the message key, and inside the message key is the image source. So that's what we're getting by doing this data.message. Okay. So now let's modify our image element. So if you remember, we have our image L, and we want to change the source. So we'll do source equals image source, and that should change the image source and thus the image that appears on our website. Okay, great. Hope that makes sense. Now let's see if it worked. Okay, let's go here, reload just in case. Let's change it. And oh, you can see we get an image of a dog. Okay, not the prettiest website, but it works. You can see as we press a new one, as we change our dog breed, we get a new image of that specific type of dog. Okay? Great. So that's it for our demo. And if you want to look at the full demo code, if you need to relook it, it's in this last slide. But I hope that all made sense. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week. Okay? Bye.